I won't simply repeat Marx as far as I understand it. The discussion tomorrow will be the way I understand why the crisis has occurred, what it is today, what underlies it, and then on Wednesday what we'll try and discuss is what have been the consequences and what are the underlying battles now occurring, like obviously occurring within the bourgeoisie and between the bourgeoisie and the working class. So today then, talking about the Marxist theory of crisis. Well, as I think everybody knows, Marx did not lay out a very clear theory of crisis in one particular place, but he did discuss it over capital and elsewhere in various levels of detail, and the most elaborate or elaborated form is in the second volume of Theories of Surplus Value, when he's discussing Ricardo. Starters usually come to the viewpoint that Marx didn't say this, that, or the other, really didn't express it, which leaves them an opportunity to actually fill in the holes. But he does say a lot about crisis. And of course, the way he puts it forward is not a mechanical form, it's in a dialectical form. It's one of the best examples of a conception of dialectics in the second volume of the Theory of Surplus Value, which leads me to begin by defining it. A crisis isn't just a downturn. It's a situation where the poles of the contradiction become antagonistic and cannot interpenetrate. That is more or less the way Marx is defining it in the chapter to which I'm referring. Let's say it's a situation where the poles cannot interpenetrate. Now, if you think about it, the logic of that is that there will continue to be various levels of conflict and interpenetration during the period of the crisis. One outcome of the crisis is disintegration. It doesn't automatically lead to the other two possibilities. That's to say, the overthrow of capitalism is clearly one of the possibilities, and the other is that the re-stabilization of capitalism. But the third possibility, which people usually ignore, is simply disintegration. I think that's very obvious at the present time. Of course, one could talk about an extended crisis, and generally in Stalinist textbooks they talk of a general crisis of capitalism, which is very much part of Stalinist theory. I would rather talk about myself about the decline of capitalism, and in this decline you have aspects of crisis, rather than simply a general crisis of capitalism itself. As you can see, there is no generally accepted Marxist theory of crisis. So when we talk about a Marxist theory of crisis, there isn't one Marxist theory of crisis. Generally, when people talk of a Marxist theory of crisis, they refer to the three aspects of crisis which are coming to, rather than what I've just referred to. So what I've done is make a distinction between decline and crisis itself. But decline has to be part of a more general understanding of crisis at the present time, one separated out, as it were. So, what I've been saying is there is, as it were, a classical theory of crisis, to the extent that there is such a theory. And then one can't simply apply it to the present day without considering the changes in capitalism itself. And so therefore the nature of crisis itself must be affected, changed, turned into something else through the fact that capitalism itself is in decline. Or if you want to, the way I certainly see it, it's in decline and in a transition period. Consequently, the nature of capital itself, in other words, changes the nature of crisis, not just empirically, but in theoretical terms. unless one, it seems to me, unless one actually does that, you produce a theory of crisis which hangs in the air, which was applicable in the 1850s or maybe in 1870, but really isn't applicable today in quite the same way. I'm saying this because what has actually been written on the present crisis isn't very good, and it rather refers much more to the classical theory than to anything else. That's above all true of what seems to be the most popular theory at the present moment, the theory of the decline in the rate of profit. I don't have much sympathy myself with that as a cause of the present crisis, but I'll be going into it. Anyway, the point I'm stressing here is the importance of being able to update Marxist theory. That's what it boils down to, and that in fact Marxist theory hasn't been updated in that way unless one adopts Stalinist theory, which is clearly wrong. I think you can distinguish four forms effectively. First is the way I've defined crisis, which is really a crisis of the system itself, which then is threatened with overthrow. Now, of course, unless there is such a possibility of overthrow, you can't talk of a crisis. Why is it a crisis? Who cares? So, something goes down, something goes up, so big deal. So, in second place, there are the regular cyclical movements. They aren't really crises. They're not crises of the system. They're simply it's moving up and down. Thirdly, there has been, and this is particularly because of the changes in the nature of capitalism, more general theories of the movement of capital over time. And they provide a base for understanding crisis. In particular, there's Trotsky's theory of the long way. And one really has to come to grips with what Trotsky was saying here. It isn't only what Trotsky is saying in itself, but the fact that he's putting forward such a theory, and other people have put forward things in parallel which arise from the same basis. That's to say, you have to understand the crises in particular times over time. And fourthly, as I've said, there are crises induced through the decline of capitalism itself. The decline I define as a situation in capitalism where there's increasing difficulty in finding forms of mediation. The logic, of course, is that if the forms of mediation become more and more difficult, either the system itself is overthrown or it does disintegrate. So that merges with the theory of crisis. Crisis itself, it has a series of stages, which we've witnessed, I think, at the present time, effectively two. First, there is First, there is a trigger. Now, the trigger, in principle, can be anything. In this case, in the case of the crisis that we came through, it's been the problem of so-called subprime mortgages. Now, that's a trigger. It isn't the immediate cause, or it isn't an underlying cause. Then there are the underlying causes themselves, which have always been described in terms of the declining rate of profit, underconsumption, and disproportionality. And then, of course, there's the end phase, which is invariably elongated for a longer or shorter time through the use of credit. But today, credit, of course, is subsumed under the title of finance capital. And today, because of finance capital, there has been a long first stage of finance capital being itself in crisis. Well, it's inherent in capitalism that it will have a problem in accumulation. As you know, capital Marx talks of accumulate, that is the law of Moses and his prophets. Accumulation must proceed to the point where it over-accumulates. It's simply in the nature of capitalism, assuming that you have classical capitalism, that it will accumulate to a point where you have over-accumulation. Because that is the basic nature of capitalism itself. It cannot do anything else. The capitalist must accumulate, otherwise it ceases to be a capitalist. It's not possible for the capitalist to stop accumulating. Of course, if the capitalist does stop accumulating, then you have an immediate problem within capitalism. And in fact, that has been partially what has actually occurred, which is again a reflection of the decline of capitalism. I'm saying this because I'll repeat it tomorrow right at the beginning, but it's so immediately visible. What the capitalist class has done in this last 20, 30 years is to convert its capital away from capital in part and turn it into money rather than capital. The figure is phenomenal. It's $14.5 trillion held in money in banks rather than in capital itself. Let's say they abdicated the position as capitalists who are investing money in order to make more money, but in the form of capital, not simply money. Let's say investing in whatever it is. They simply hand it over to banks to do whatever it is. That's why it took this phenomenal monetary form. And one has to ask, why, what's going on? Why are the capitalists doing that? Now, obviously, in a classical capitalism, that wouldn't happen. So, the stress in capital, the whole nature of capitalism is accumulation, and accumulation means the investment of capital in productive capital, not simply money producing more money. Marx is very, very clear in Capital, in the various chapters of Volume 1, and right throughout, if you read the results in the immediate process of production, it's even clearer there, that a capitalist is not a capitalist unless he keeps accumulating in productive capital. So that it is an entire system in which accumulation proceeds in the productive sectors. In other words, producing more value. Value, of course, is contributed socially necessary later time. Money is the first stage, but it's not the whole entity. Capital is different. So if capital converts itself into money, it is not capital in itself. It doesn't have the basis of exploitation, in other words. And yet, curiously, this is what has actually occurred in this stage. It's not curious because we understand the decline of capitalism, the nature of finance capital. But that is what has actually occurred. So the capitalist has abdicated his role as capitalist, as capitalist effect to a degree in the present time. One has to understand it, understand why it's taking this particular form. The second point you can make is that if you read Capital, particularly Volume 2, you wonder why capitalism exists at all. How come it didn't break down immediately? And particularly if you look at the question of the relationship between Departments 1 and 2. Departments 1 and 1, you know what I'm talking about. Producer goods sector and consumer goods sector. I'm taking this as an illustration of the overall point that if you start to look at the movement of capital, underlying that, as it were, is this constant drive to produce more and more value, because of course capital is self-expanding value, which leads to a point where it becomes far greater than can actually be employed within capitalism itself. Now, that's automatic right from the beginning. So in Volume 2 of Capital, for instance, what he does there is discuss the relationship between Departments 1 and 2. How come they're able to interrelate when the essence of capital is shown in producer goods itself, capital goods? How come it doesn't constantly exceed the possibility of its use in producing consumer goods? Because you can't have a capitalism which only produces producer goods, as some theorists try to theorize, and Goranovsky in particular. Obviously it makes a nonsense if what you have is capital only producing capital, goods and nothing else. And so in Volume 2 of Capital, he tries to interrelate these two sectors. Now, if you actually go through those figures, you'll see that he fixed them. It's not that he was being dishonest. He deliberately fixed them to show that it is possible for capitalism to function. Now, if you don't fix them the way he fixed them, then it just doesn't work out. There's no way, if you put it into a computer and have an elementary grid, as it were, put it into Excel and try and work out those figures, there's no way that they are going to work out over time. Just no way that you can get it to work out. It'll just break down. What Marx is showing is that it's possible for a time for it to work. Well, that is true. But it's inherent in it that it will break down. It's absolutely clear. If you don't believe me, just take the figures and input the changes over time, the rising organic composition of capital and so on, and you'll see that it just doesn't work out. That's to say, Department 1 will tend to exceed Department 2 to a greater and greater degree. Now, the logic, of course, is that capitalism then has effectively to slow down, adjust its rate of productivity, and so forth. So, in other words, inherent in it is that capitalism itself has to limit its accumulation. What he's saying implicitly is that to a degree that is actually occurring, even in the classical stages. It doesn't actually say that, but that's what's implicit. So, curiously, what Marx is trying to do, which most people don't think, as it were, but it is clear once you realize that he fixed the figures, is he's trying to show that capitalism, although it would naturally, as it were, fall over, has a way of existing. And it's that one actually has to look at. In other words, the mediating forms of capitalism which allow it to go on. Now, as you know, Volume 2 of Capital are really his notes, which are put together by Engels. So we don't have a general theory as to where it's going. What I'm doing is trying to surmise what is actually there. So the same point, and I'll repeat what I'm saying in a different, from a different angle. The same thing really applies to the concept of the falling rate of profit. When Marx is discussing in Volume 3, he said it's a capitalism gone senile. Now, it's a bit difficult to see capitalism being senile when he's actually writing that. You know, talking of 1860s, 70s. Now, it's true that Lenin dates the decline of capitalism in that period, so one could say, well, this is really Marx understanding capitalism in a way which we wouldn't have thought otherwise. I spent quite a lot of time trying to find if he ever uses the word decline in relation to capitalism, and as far as I know, he does not. So it's remarkable that he does refer to a senile capitalism. But it's not really that clear when he says that. I mean, it looks much more as if he's being ambiguous when he uses the word senile. However, the point of this is simply to say that if there really is a falling rate of profit, well, in that case, why does capitalism keep functioning? Why doesn't it just fall? Even if there are offsetting factors, which is what he discusses, the logic of it is that it would simply go down. So why does capitalism continue to function? So then, of course, you end up again talking about what Engels calls offsetting factors, which would be more correctly called internal factors within the law itself, which prevent it operating in that simple form. What this goes back to is the same point I made in relation to the question of disproportionality, and that is that to understand the falling rate of profit, you really have to understand its opposite. That's to say, rising productivity. It's the rising productivity which makes the falling rate of profit, but in turn, it's the rising productivity which provides higher profits. So, it's that aspect that becomes crucial over time. The more general question is that a crisis is in fact a crisis of the system, and insofar as it is a crisis of the system, it also becomes a question of consciousness, particularly today. We don't live in a capitalism where the ruling class isn't conscious and cannot act on its consciousness. Maybe it could never be completely separated, but in the 19th century you didn't have the same state, you didn't have monopolies in the same way, you didn't have finance capital to organize capitalism. Today you do. The capitalist class is, at the moment, more conscious than is the working class itself. As it happened, particularly because those who were brought up during the time of war, during the time when the Soviet Union had come into existence, say in the 20s, have died off, the ruling class looks stupid. I have to say, in the way it's been acting, you can't call it very intelligent. In previous periods, it was far more intelligent. It understood that it could be overthrown, and it took measure to see to it that there was both repression and, importantly, concession. At the present moment, it's very hard to call it very intelligent. But I would say many of these measures are stupid. So the question then ceases to be a technical issue, or simply a question of capitalists accumulating in a kind of mindless way. What one has to discuss in the course of the crisis is the nature of the class struggle itself. Of course, that's what we discussed in the third session. It's fairly obvious that if the working class is defeated, wages can be depressed, and profits rise. And again, it's fairly obvious that at this present time, the ruling class is trying to, governments are trying to depress wages. To the extent to which it is successful, of course, the crisis can come to an end. Because it's a crisis, I've defined it in a particular way, but it's also a crisis between the working class and the ruling class. It's a crisis between labor and capital in theoretical terms, and then in consciousness it's a crisis between the working class and the ruling class. But to discuss it, one really has to understand the political economic history of a particular country and of global capitalism. Quite obviously, again, when Marx is talking about capitalism, he's talking about a national capitalism. He's explicit about it, although, of course, the whole theory becomes a global theory. But when he's discussing crisis and most other things like labour theory of value, he's talking about a national capitalism. Today, that's impossible. Clearly, we have had for a long time a global capitalism. The fact that the term globalization was used in the last 20 years is really irrelevant. The only thing that was globalized, in fact, in this period was finance capital. Industrial capital continues to be largely national capital. However, it's closely interrelated with the world capitalism. So, obviously, one must therefore discuss it in a more general context in which there are particular aspects of the world economy which modify the actual theory. So, for instance, at the present time, when, as we were talking about, I was talking about, there was the question of the producer goods and consumer goods sector. It's absolutely clear that there is today a world division of labor in these terms. We're talking of Germany and Japan playing a particular role in relation to producer goods, as opposed to Britain, which most people don't think produces almost nothing, except ether, as it were. But it isn't quite as bad as that in Britain. It's been downplayed, as it were. Or people have underestimated the degree of industrialization in Britain. But the fact is that Germany today is the powerhouse of machine tools, of custom-made machine tools. In particular, Japan tends to produce mass-produced machine tools rather than custom-made machine tools, although there is an overlap between the two. And of course, there are machine tools produced in other countries, France, United States, etc. But nonetheless, there is that division of labour, now as a particular result. And if one extends it, finance capital, although it is global and applies to all countries, nonetheless, it's no accident that you get Germany and France opposing Britain and the United States as the finance capitalist powers. They are acting in their own interest completely correctly. They are not themselves finance capitalist powers. They're much more based on industry as opposed to Britain. So one has to understand the crisis in that international context, as well as simply in technical terms. It becomes a certain division between national capitals as well. Well, I'll briefly go over the form of the crisis itself, the classical way in which it's seen. The way in which Marx puts it in Capital is that one begins from a situation where, say, there had been a downturn, and then there's a period of growth because profits are rising. In that case, wages rise, employment goes up, innovation increases, and total production rises. So accumulate. The standard of living goes up. The result is that because wages are going up, profits get squeezed by the strength of the working class. So the capitalist class then replaces men with machines, wages fall, reserve army of labour rises. Profits rise, and they are reinvested. There's then, of course, a problem that since wages are static, employment is going down, and that production has increased beyond demand as workers' salaries have declined. Part of the slack is then taken up by investment in producer goods, but in the end, production must result in the supply of consumer goods. And to a degree, this is mitigated by the fact that more workers are being employed but the capitalist class needs to keep wages down to maintain profits. And so they have to keep the reserve army of labour in operation. So it becomes a juggling act on the part of the capitalist class, in which they try to effectively increase consumption, raise profits, and put investment into producing goods. It was Lenin in particular, Lenin and Preobrazhensky, who put the stress on the argument that capitalism wasn't planned, and since it wasn't, let's say, accumulation necessarily went beyond its limits, there would be a disproportionality between the two sectors. Now, that's in Lenin's book on the development of capitalism in Russia in the first two chapters. But it's developed in great detail by Preobrazhensky in the 20s. He wrote 3 essays, effectively. He's, of course, in reality trying to discuss the question of social one country, and eventually comes to the conclusion that it's technically impossible. But he uses the schemes of reproduction for this purpose. And for him, for Preobrazhensky, the question of disproportionality is to a degree mediated by the agricultural sector, which acts as a kind of sink in which to coordinate the two sectors in the developed part of the economy. Preobrazhensky was, of course, in the left opposition, then capitulated in 1928, and was duly jailed by Stalin in the early 30s. He then wrote a book on the nature of capitalism, which has been translated. It's worth reading. Obviously, most people haven't read him, but he's one of the most important Marxist theorists that there actually have been. So, in reality then, the question of disproportionality or overaccumulation question of underconsumption is juggled by the capitalist class, partly by limiting investment, creating a surplus of capital, and partly by increasing employment, so increasing total wages. I just introduced the word surplus capital, and for me that's the crucial understanding that we must have at the present time. Marx doesn't use the word surplus capital in quite the same way, or he doesn't actually use it. The point is that at the present time, as I've illustrated by referring to the capitalist class not investing, there's a huge level of capital which isn't being invested, being turned into money. And that is surplus capital. Some of it is in the banks, some of it is not, but it's actually an absolutely huge level in which the capitalist class isn't investing. One has to ask them, why isn't it investing? By not investing, of course, it prevents at one level a crisis. You're not getting this division between the sectors, or you're not getting the third aspect, which I've gone into, the question of underconsumption. That's to say, investing in the consumer goods sector on a large scale. If you keep wages down, quite obviously there's going to be a problem over time, which historically would have been solved by going into the producer goods sector, except the producer goods sector is already, as it were, in conflict with the consumer goods sector. So the logic of it has been that they've withdrawn their capital from industry. Now again, that's very obvious in America and Britain, but it's not just America and Britain. And what they did, very consciously at the end of the 70s, was go into finance capital. And that's why this cartoon, which of present crisis, actually does reflect a kind of real world. The cartoon says corporate profits are up. The reason is reduced payroll costs. Sales are zero, but we laid off so many workers, profits are up. It goes on to says, well, we've reached 200% unemployment. Capitalism is now perfect. Well, that's the kind of logic, although it's a cartoon, there is that logic which we're actually in which capital has, in a sense, ceased to be capital by going into finance capital in this particular way. Let's say it's not exploiting labor, trying not to exploit labor, trying to get money out of money, which is inherently impossible. Money cannot make money. Although it's very hard to get that across to a capitalist. And if anybody who tried to speak to a capitalist and say, but money can't make money, they say, well, why not? I make it all the time. So, what I've tried to outline in a very almost caricatured form, limited form, is the three forms of underconsumption, disproportionality, and falling rate of profit. Except that I haven't discussed the falling rate of profit in detail, except to not say very much. So I'll briefly do that and indicate why I don't think it has much to say for itself in this particular instance. It follows automatically that if you adopt the labour theory of value, that there will be a falling rate of profit. That is so because the logic of capitalism is one of innovation and therefore replacement of labour by capital. So if you look at it, the logic of it is that increasingly machines are made by machines. I think I've quoted before, and often quote Hegel, who actually says in his book on law, he actually does refer there to an argument which he actually says that eventually we're going to get to a point where machines make machines. Well, that is the logic of capitalism, and it is a logic which Marx approves of, because it allows socialism to come to be. That specific function of capitalism, to force people to a point where you can eventually get to socialism, you can get to abundance, you can get to a position where machines are making machines. But if machines are making machines, and there's no labour time involved, there is no value. Logically, therefore, there is no value, there is no profit. That's the ultimate, as it were, of it. And logically, the ultimate position is there is no profit because there is no value. But that's the ultimate. But somewhere along the line between the word then and now, you expect the rate of profit to decline. Now, that's the argument. Well, it does seem to me that you can't get away from it. If you take the labour theory of value, that is true. Marx is discussing it because when he was writing, rate of profit had fallen. Orthodox economists talked of it as a natural feature of putting factors of production together, that you'll get things diminished return. So for them, it's a natural feature of things, as it were. Marx is saying, no, it's social. However, if that was the case, why do we have any profit at all today? So that just doesn't work out. You can't just say there's falling rate of profit and say we have profits today. Well, why do we have profits today when it had fallen already 140 years ago? Luxemburg said the rate of profit will fall, take as long to fall as the moon to fall down. Now she was, I think, actually wrong in putting it in a totally abstract way. But we have to look at it much more concretely. And part of the law, it's not really a law, some people like talking about it as a law, but Marx doesn't actually call it a law. The part of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall is rising productivity. Now, rising productivity would automatically, of course, lead to rising profits, even though what it's doing is causing workers to lose their jobs. But rising productivity also can mean lower costs of capital itself, in which case you reach a neutral situation. If the cost of production of consumer goods and of capital goods actually falls, it can mean that there is no decline in the rate of profit. Now, both those things are true at various times. It's not always true, but both those things have been true in the last 30, 40 years. Now, so ultimately, the falling rate of profit theory is going to depend on the argument that capital goods tend over long periods of time to rise. Well, that is true, but it's over long periods of time. If, of course, consumer goods tend to go down, it means that the cost of labor goes down too. In other words, profits don't necessarily fall. The point of what I'm saying is that while it is necessarily true, if you support the labour theory of value and you think that the running composition of capital, or the capital-labour ratio, in other words, are correct, that there's a rising capital-labour ratio or rising running composition of rising capital composition over time. If you think that is true, then the rate of profit must fall. But it doesn't necessarily fall in a crisis. Nobody linked it to a crisis until the 20th century. And it was Grossman in particular, Paul Matic, and then in this country the really peculiar arguments over here of David Yaffe and various others, who've insisted on the falling rate of profit in an extremely dogmatic way. It hasn't really been worked out. It's just been turned into a kind of theorem. I don't think Marxism works that way. It's very easy to do that, to talk of the falling rate of profit for the reasons I've just given. But it's not just an abstract issue, as I'm trying to point out. And it isn't just that they're countervailing forces. Those so-called countervailing forces are part of the movement of the rate of profit itself. They're not just outside it, which is the way people tend to think of it because of the words offsetting factors, which were used by Engels, and which are not in the text. I'm not blaming Engels, he just used the term and it's been misused. So the actual result is that some people have then turned it into a kind of fetish. You can't do that with whatever law, but the falling rate of profit theory, so forth, has become a kind of absolute fetish. And I think if you're going to argue that it causes crisis, it has to be more than a secular tendency. It is a secular tendency, but it has to be more than a secular tendency. It's got to like it's got to go up and down, as it were. The rate of profit got to go up and down, and you have to show that in a particular instance, rate of profit has declined because of the falling rate of profit theory argument. Nobody's ever done that. Andrew Kleeman is the one person who has been trying to argue precisely what I just said. You'll get his stuff on the net. He belongs to the Raya Dunayevskaya group in the United States.
She's trying to go
Andrew Kleeman, K-L-I-M-A. You'll get his stuff on the net. He's at Pace. He's at Pace in New York, Pace College University in New York. Well, he has tried to argue it, but it's a pretty dubious argument. It's pretty flawed. Why is that? I don't spend too much time with you. You could spend days and days talking about this. It's become a kind of major issue on the left. There are two problems. First, it's very hard to calculate what is the rate of profit in Marxist terms. So it's not calculated in Marxist terms, obviously. They don't calculate profits on the basis of the later theory of value. So it's very hard to do it. And a number of people have tried to argue that you can just use existing figures. You can't. One of the main reasons you can't is you have to take out the unproductive sector. You can't just say, well, this is the price kind of thing. That's the beginning and end of it. So, and from that we get profits. Well, if you're trying to work out profits today of a company, you could take the existing profits to begin with, then you would have to add to it the various unproductive aspects, that's finance, the cost of finance, cost of advertising, etc., etc., etc. So the profits would become very much greater. Of course, that's what Sweezy and Baran were doing in the book on monopoly capital, except that they had a different kind of theory overall. But profits in Marxist terms would be very much greater. You have to do it if you want to really work out what are profits in Marxist terms, and not profits in, as it were, bourgeois terms, or as they actually used. I don't really want to done that. You'd have to work out the amount of depreciation which isn't depreciation but is advertising in the case of cars, and add it to in Marxist terms, surplus value, because it's unproductive. I don't know anybody who's even tried to get into it. Again, Susie Moran did to a degree, but you can't actually work it out. It's not that it's inherently impossible, but it's very difficult for individual Marxists to do it, and no doubt it's possible if you had a country which was specialized in doing it, or maybe a few institutes which were doing it. But obviously, individual Marxists or 5 Marxists or whatever would find it very difficult. There's another objection, which is very obvious, which we all know, and that is companies don't declare profits which actually exist. They have an incentive to either reduce or increase their profits. Their incentive to increase their profits in the past has been that would mean an increase in the share price. And the managers get their bonuses, as you know, in terms of rising share prices and so forth. So the incentive would be to inflate the profits. Now, how do you discover this? Alternatively, they don't want to pay taxes, so they reduce the profits. Or they have to hide the profits because they got them illegally, so they put or the losses, so they put them so-called offshore. Or they simply inflate their profits by, for instance, in the case of Microsoft, they paid, I don't know how many of the workers, but some number of workers, maybe all their workers in shares. And then, of course, didn't take the cost of the shares. So, of course, they had a wonderful company where they had no cost of labor, huge profits. Now, you can go through 101 ways in which they've done it. And it's one of the reasons, of course, they're going for this, what amounts to almost a collapse. Because it's not clear what the profits really are. Well, how does a Marxist then work out what is going on? It's very, very difficult to actually be able to simply say that it went up and went down like that. Unfortunately, I think many of the arguments have been based simply on falling rate of profit. Saying, well, there's falling rate of profit, that's why this occurred. That's certainly the argument of the SWP, of Chris Harman. It's just mad. But it's worse than mad, it's a kind of fetish. Because you don't have the past there, you simply have a falling rate of profit. God knows where it came from, but there it is. So it suddenly happened. It doesn't make much sense, it doesn't give you much of an understanding. In my view, if one's looking at the period of crisis, you have to look at all three aspects which are referred to: the falling rate of profit, you have to look at the question of disproportionality, you have to look at underconsumption, and all three are in fact involved. You have to be able to work out how they interrelate, how they're changing over time. They're not just involved when there's a downturn, they're involved when there's an upturn, because they are applying at all times. But what's happened is that the ruling class or capitalist class or the middle capitalist has found ways around it. And they go from one problem to another problem until they can no longer, as it were, hold the fort. Then the downturn occurs, when all three aspects can no longer be held. That's when the downturn comes about, it seems to me. What I've just said is that once you understand crisis, I support the fourth theory of it, that it involves all three of the aspects, not one of the aspects. When a crisis occurs, you have the trigger, but you also have one of the aspects which appears as the primary one. It may not be the primary, but it immediately appears the primary one. At the present time, it very much looks like underconsumption is being primary. I'm not saying it is primary, but that's the way it looks. Because you have, as I say, this huge accumulation of capital at one level, of wealth at one level, of incomes. You have these extremely wealthy people on the one hand, and you have a static standard of living on the other. And it's very obvious. Figures come out in newspapers regularly of how today profits as a percentage, official figures, profits as a percentage of value added are greater than they've ever been since the war, which was completely, if you were to accept different figures, completely contradictory already, probably. But immediately it then appears that what you have is static incomes and rising levels of accumulation. Well, obviously that cannot go on. Now that's what's been basically said, and of course it's true. But that doesn't follow that that is the underlying reason, because all that follows is it is one of the aspects which has played a crucial role, and it's the immediate reason. What I'm trying to argue is that in effect it's all three, though how they actually operate and interrelate, one has to work out in each particular crisis, and in this case, in this particular crisis, one has to work it out. This crisis, of course, has been very different in the enormous role of finance capital. And so one has to go back into that to try and explain how that goes. And that's what I'm going to do to discuss tomorrow. Thank you.